Welcome to the Daily News Currents. Today is Tuesday, January 14th, and for today's headlines we have: Mummies' ancient tattoos come under laser focus. A Texas man is arrested in Indianapolis on a charge of stalking WNBA's Caitlin Clark. DeSantis calls special session to enforce Trump's immigration mandates. Columbia professor says she was pushed to retire because of her activism. Have Americas ever really been healthy? Mummies' ancient tattoos come under laser focus. With a tool often used in the study of dinosaur fossils, scientists uncovered new details in ornate tattoos on the skin members of Chronicle culture of Peru. A culture flourished along the central Peruvian coast from about AD 900 to 1500. Called the Kanke, they left behind a wealth of cultural remains, including intricate tattoos that are preserved to this day on the skin of mummified individuals. New details of these tattoos that are previously hidden to the naked eye include finely traced lines, were described in a study published on Monday. After illuminating the mummies with laser-stimulated fluorescence, or LSF, an imaging tool that until now had never been applied to tattoos, scientists discovered lines 0.1 to 0.2 millimeters wide, narrower than work produced by most modern tattoo needles. We were shocked by just how fine the tattoo lines were in the LSF images, said Michael Pittman, an assistant professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and an author of the new study in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in an email. We immediately knew what we were seeing was special. The mummies featured in the study had been buried at the Cerro Colorado Cemetery and were rediscovered in 1981. The tattoos were roughly 1,000 years old and display ornate geometric designs reminiscent of scales or vines, as well as anthropomorphous animals with a curled tail. The Chronicle have long been known for high levels of craftsmanship across their material culture, and left elaborate markings and far more than their tattoos, said Aaron Dieter Wolf, a prehistoric archaeologist at the Tennessee Division of Archaeology who specializes in ancient tattoos and was not involved in the study. Dr. Pittman, a dinosaur paleobiologist, had spent more than a decade probing fossils with laser-stimulated fluorescence. This non-invasive tool exposes specimens to high-powered lasers, producing a fluorescent glow that sometimes reveals subtle features like soft tissues. In recent years, Dr. Pittman's team has started exploring the archaeological applications for the technique. We expect LSF to work on other ancient tattoos from different cultures around the world, and have plans to continue this imaging work to uncover similarly exciting discoveries, Dr. Pittman said. Hopefully we can push back the complexity of ancient tattoos even further back in time. Mr. Dieter Wolf was not convinced that the study demonstrated clear advantage of LSF over other techniques for scrutinizing ancient tattoos, such as multi-spectral imaging. This is a cool additional tool in our kit, but it's not groundbreaking, he said. He also had concerns about some of the study's conclusions. Dr. Pittman's team suggested in the study that the tattoo patterns were made from punctures by a fine instrument, like a cactus needle or a sharpened animal bone. Dr. Dieter Wolf believes that most tattoos examined in the study were made with incisions, not punctures. A painter uses different paintbrushes to achieve different results, Dr. Dieter Wolf said. Tattooists have done the same thing for thousands of years, so depending on the tool that they are using, you would get a different physical signature as a result. Dr. Pittman stood by his team's conclusion that the tattoos were made by puncture. The unique thinness of our tattoo lines among published Chronicle tattoos suggests a needle-based production, puncturing tattoo, is more reasonable, he said in an email. Pinning down the methods that tattooists use is an important step in interpreting the meaning of body art to past societies. A range of techniques were used across cultures, and the process of making body art was often imbued in ritual significance. For example, Otzi, a 5,300-year-old Iceman with the oldest known body art on a mummy, may have been inked primarily for therapeutic reasons rather than just aesthetics. While it's natural to wonder why the Chronicle took such pains with their work, their motivation remains a mystery. These are not purely artistic expressions, Mr. Dieter Wolf said. They are very culturally loaded. The tattoo is the tip of the iceberg, he noted, but there's a whole cultural framework that underlies it. A Texas man is arrested in Indianapolis on the charge of stalking WNBA's Caitlin Clark. Authorities in Indiana have arrested a man on a felony stalking charge after he allegedly sent harassing messages to basketball star Caitlin Clark, then traveled to Indianapolis in an attempt to see her, according to prosecutors. The 55-year-old man, a resident of Texas identified by prosecutors as Michael Thomas Lewis, sent Clark messages on social media site X, beginning in mid-December and continuing in January, even after police questioned him in Indianapolis. He was arrested in Indiana on Sunday, records show. The messages, many of them sexually explicit, others detailing his attempts to see her in person, were concerning enough to Clark that she altered her public appearances and patterns of movement due to fear for her safety, according to charging documents released Monday by the Marion County Prosecutor's Office. No matter how prominent of a figure you are, this case shows that online harassment can quickly escalate to actual threats of physical violence, Marion County Prosecutor Ryan Mears said in a statement. It takes a lot of courage for women to come forward in these cases, which is why many don't. In doing so, the victim is setting an example for all women who deserve to live and work in Indy without the threat of sexual violence. The felony charge, known formally as criminal stalking, carries a prison sentence of 1 to 6 years and a fine of up to $10,000. The man claimed it was an imaginary relationship. The nature of Lewis's messages drew the attention of the FBI, court records show. An investigation revealed that he had sent the most recent communications from an Indianapolis public library and a hotel in the city's downtown, about a half a mile from the basketball arena where Clark's team, the Indiana Fever, plays during the WNBA season. Been driving around your house 3 times a day, Lewis wrote in a message, documented by authorities. But don't call the law just yet. The public is allowed to drive by a Gamebridge fieldhouse, aka Caitlin's fieldhouse. His presence in Indianapolis concerned police, prosecutors said. Officers visited Lewis at his hotel room, where he told them he was in Indianapolis for vacation. When asked about the posts that were threatening in nature, Lewis said it wasn't him. Lewis claimed that this was just an imaginary relationship. Sergeant Darren Stonehouse wrote in a police affidavit. Lewis was banned from arena premises, but he continued to harass Clark, prosecutors say. Got banned from the arena. I'm sorry. Maybe I go to your road games? It's okay, right? He wrote, according to authorities. A preliminary court date was set for Tuesday morning. As of Monday afternoon, Lewis has not yet retained or been assigned a lawyer, according to court records. Clark is one of the most well-known athletes in the U.S., man or woman. Her stardom began in the University of Iowa and has followed her into the WNBA, where she played her rookie season last year. Women in sports are regularly subjected to intense harassment online, especially basketball players. Players in last year's NCAA Division I women's basketball tournament received the most brutal and the most troubling and the nastiest comments of any collegiate sport. NCAA President Charlie Baker told a Senate committee last month. We talked to a lot of folks who played in those tournaments, and they said the stuff that comes in their DMs is a lot worse than what we see on their public handle, Baker said. DeSantis calls special session to enforce Trump's immigration mandates. Governor Ron DeSantis has called a special session of Florida's legislature to begin January 27th to discuss, among other things, immigration reform. DeSantis said the Florida legislature will be tasked with writing laws that require state and local law enforcement to comply with and carry out new federal immigration mandates under the upcoming Trump administration, and to punish any local municipality or actors that try to defy these orders. There is also needs to be measured to hold people accountable who are violating our anti-sanctuary policies, and then Florida needs to make sure that we don't have any lingering incentives for people to come to our state illegally, said DeSantis. The governor said he's previously previewed several of these mandates at meetings with President-elect Trump, including a recent meeting with Republican governors at Mar-a-Lago's last week. He was mum on what they said, hinting only that extending what's known as 287G contracts might be part of these mandates. These contracts deputize local and state law enforcement officers to act as immigration or ICE agents to identify, process, and detain immigration offenders. Trump himself has threatened mass deportation of people who are in the country illegally. The governor said he also wants to see an immediate end to in-state tuition for undocumented students, which he calls an incentive for illegal immigration, during a special session. No more excuses on this. We need to move all incentives to come to the state of Florida illegally, and that is one of them. So we will have the responsibility to act, and we will, said DeSantis. DeSantis said he expects enforcing these new immigration mandates could cost the state of Florida tens of millions of dollars, which could be used to expand law enforcement's immigration efforts and to build more detention facilities in the state. He said hurricane relief funding and condo reform will also be discussed during the special session. The state's regular legislative session begins March 4th. Local Democratic Representative Anna Eskamani spoke out against the special session, calling it a waste of taxpayer dollars and a political spectacle. Floridians are struggling with skyrocketing housing and insurance costs, unaffordable health care, and stagnant wages, said Eskamani in a statement. Instead of addressing these pressing issues, Governor DeSantis is prioritizing attacks on immigrants, undermining a democratic process, and giving himself more power to override the will of the people. Columbia professor says she was pushed to retire because of her activism. Catherine Frank, a law professor and vocal advocate of pro-Palestinian students, had been under investigation over remarks she made about Israeli students. Columbia University and one of its longtime law professors, Catherine Frank, had severed ties after an investigation stemming from her advocacy on behalf of pro-Palestinian students. It was the latest fallout from student and faculty activism related to the Gaza war on a major university campus. Ms. Frank, a tenured professor known primarily for her work as founder and director of Columbia Center for Gender and Sexuality Law, had been an advocate for pro-Palestinian students as protests erupted on the campus last school year. She was also one of the several faculty members investigated by the university over allegations of anti-Semitism after the school received complaints about comments she made about Israelis on a radio program. Describing her departure as a termination dressed up in more palatable terms, Ms. Frank said in a statement on Friday that she had reached an agreement with the university to leave because Columbia had become a toxic and hostile environment. A Columbia University spokeswoman, Samantha Slater, said in a statement that the university was committed to being a community that is welcoming to all and our policies prohibit discrimination and harassment. She added that a complaint had been filed alleging discriminatory harassment in violation of our policies. An investigation was conducted and a finding was issued. In a statement on Friday, the Center for Constitutional Rights, a nonprofit legal advocacy organization where Ms. Frank previously served on the board, called the end of Ms. Frank's Columbia career an egregious attack on both academic freedom and Palestinian rights advocacy. The investigation of Ms. Frank involved comments she made on a left-leaning media platform, Democracy Now!, after an incident on January 2024 on the steps of Columbia's Low Library. A smelly substance had been released on pro-Palestinian students during a rally, demanding the university divest from Israel. One student who was suspended in connection with the incident and who subsequently sued the university was identified as former member of the Israel Defense Forces. In the Democracy Now! Interview several days later, Ms. Frank said she and other professors at Columbia had been concerned about Israeli students coming to Columbia right out of their military service because they'd been known to harass Palestinian and other students on campus. Two Columbia colleagues filed a complaint against Ms. Frank, saying that her comments amounted to harassment of Israeli members of the Columbia community. An outside law firm hired by the university to investigate the complaint found last November that the remarks violated equal opportunity and affirmative action policies, which Ms. Frank said she appealed. The investigator also concluded that Ms. Frank had violated policy by disclosing the name of one of the complaints against her and reposting a social media post that made disparaging comments about him. During a congressional hearing in April, Dr. Minij Shavik, then Columbia president, was asked by Representative Elise Stefanik, Republican of New York, what disciplinary actions had been taken against Ms. Frank. Ms. Stefanik misquoted Ms. Frank as having said that all Israeli students who served in the IDF are dangerous and shouldn't be on campus. During the hearing, Dr. Shafik responded, "I agree with you that these comments are completely unacceptable and discriminatory." Dr. Shafik's remarks during the hearing about Ms. Frank and others drew sharp rebukes from faculty members as inappropriate and damaging to her relationship with the faculty. Dr. Shafik resigned several months later, becoming the third university president who appeared before the congressional committee to leave her job. In her statement on Friday, Ms. Frank called Dr. Shafik's remarks during the hearing defamatory. President Shafiq was aware at the time that Congresswoman Stefanik's summary of my comments were grossly inaccurate and misleading, Ms. Frank said. She said in the hearing testimony led to death threats against her, as well as other forms of harassment. After Dr. Shafiq's testimony, she wrote, colleagues had videotaped her without her consent and leaked the videos to right-wing organizations. Students, she said, had gone so far, too, as to enroll in her class to provoke discussions that they could record and post online and file complaints about her. I also have come to regard Columbia University as having lost its commitment to its unique and important mission, Ms. Frank said in her statement. Rather than fostering critical debate, research, and learning, she said, the universe has demonstrated a willingness to collaborate with the very enemies of our academic mission. Have Americans ever really been healthy? Medical historians say the phrase, make America healthy again, obscures a past during which the country's people ate, smoked, and drank things that mostly left them unwell. We will make Americans healthy again, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has declared. A political action committee that has promoted Mr. Kennedy's President-elect Donald J. Trump's pick for Health and Human Services Secretary said his movement is igniting a health revolution in America. But the word, again, presumes a time in the country's past when Americans were at better health. Was there ever really a time when America was healthier? For historians of medicine, there is a short answer. No, said Nancy Tones, a historian at Stony Brook University. John Harley Warner, a historian at Yale, said, it's hard for me to think of a time when America, with all the real health disparities that characterize our system, was healthier. Dr. Jeremy Green, a historian at Johns Hopkins University, asked, which particular era does RFK want us to take us back to? Probably not the 19th and early 20th century. Rich men smoked cigarettes and cigars, the poor chewed tobacco, heavy drinking was the norm. It was definitely a drinking culture, said Dora Costa, an economic historian at the University of California, Los Angeles. Drinking was a huge problem. Saloons were a huge concern. Men were drinking away their paychecks. That's the reason we had prohibition. And Dr. Costa notes, American diets for most of the 19th century were monotonous. It's true that agriculture at the time was organic. Food was locally produced, and there were no ultra-processed foods. But fresh fruits and vegetables were in short supply because they were difficult to ship and because growing seasons were so short. For the most part, Dr. Costa said, until the 1930s, Americans were living off dried fruits and vegetables. As for protein, Americans were relying on salted pork, she said, because meat was so difficult to preserve. Only after the Civil War did meatpackers in Chicago begin to process meat and ship beef across the country. At that point, Dr. Costa said, beef became a large part of the American diet. But even though the availability of beef helped diversify diets, people did not become healthier. Dr. Costa worked on Robert Fogel, a University of Chicago economic historian and a Nobel laureate, to understand the health of a population of Americans living in the North around this period by examining the medical records of Union Army soldiers. Common conditions like hernias were untreatable. Men had hernias as big as grapefruits, held in by trusses. 19% of those soldiers had heart valve problems by the time they were 60, compared to about 8.5% today. Poor nutrition led to poor health. People were thin, often too thin. In 1900, 6.1% of Union Army veterans were underweight, a risk factor for various illnesses and other marker of ill health, compared with 1.6% of U.S. adults today. In 1850, males at age 20 could expect to live around 61 years. Today, it is 74 years. The start of the 20th century saw public health improvements, cleaner water, for example, and posters advising parents not to give their babies beer. But disease was rampant. There was no antibiotics and very few vaccines. When the 1918 flu struck the nation, no one knew the cause. The flu virus had not yet been discovered, and strange folk remedies were rampant. About 675,000 Americans died. In 1929, the Great Depression began, and its economic toll over the next decade led to several nutritional and health problems. Health evolved in the second half of the 20th century, but was poor compared with that today. Many people are nostalgic for the 1950s and 60s, seeing those decades as a time of prosperity, where the American pharmaceutical industry pumped out new medical advances, antibiotics, antipsychotics, drugs for high blood pressure, and vaccines for tetanus, diphtheria, measles, and polio. Despite that progress, those years were terrible for health, Dr. Green said, with a tremendous amount of heart attacks and strokes. Heart disease was rampant in 1950, with 322 deaths per 100,000 Americans annually from cardiovascular disease, double the rate today. By 1960, Dr. Green said, heart disease was responsible for 1/3 of all deaths in America. In part, that was because nearly everyone smoked. We are among the heaviest smoking countries, said Samuel Preston, an emeritus professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. David F. Musto, a medical historian at Yale who died in 2010, once said in an interview that although he never enjoyed smoking, the social pressure to smoke when he was in college in the 1950s was so great that I felt it was my duty to find my brand. Smoking greatly increased the risk for heart disease, the leading killer in the 1950s and 60s. Heart disease death rates plummeted in recent decades because smoking is much less common now, and treatment for heart disease is much more effective. Cholesterol-lowering statins, introduced in 1987, reduced the risk of heart disease. Other new medications, as well as bypass surgery and stents, also saved lives. Cancer was the second leading killer in the 1950s, as it is today, but in 1950, there were 194 cancer deaths per 100,000 people. Now, there are 142 cancer deaths per 100,000 people. A decline in smoking is a leading reason, but there's also been revolution in cancer treatment. Until the 1990s, cancer was treated with brute force, surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy. Now an array of targeted therapies are turning some cancers, once deadly, into treatable chronic diseases, or even curing them. Dr. Green said he was not surprised by the idea of a halcyon past when people were healthier. There's a long history in America for nostalgia for a past that was better than the present, he said. History is all about erasure, the things we don't choose to remember. Today is not some sort of health utopia, of course. Researchers are quick to acknowledge that Americans' health is not as good as it can be, and they bemoan the huge disparities in healthcare in the country. Yet the U.S. spends more on medical care than other countries, an average of $12,555 per capita, which is about twice what other wealthy countries spend. But historians say the past is actually much worse, and so they say the phrase, "make America healthy again," makes no sense. As an historian of health, I don't know what again Kennedy is imagining, Dr. Tomes said. The idea that once upon a time all Americans were healthy is a fantasy. That is all that we have for today. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye!